Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijwijken and I co-direct the Transnational NGO Initiative here at the Maxwell School. Today I'm undertaking a brief interview with Tawanda Mutasah, the International Director of Programs in Open Society Foundations, which used to be called Open Society Initiative. Thank you, Tawanda, for allowing us to interview you today. This will surely be a helpful tool for students as well as faculty. I always like to start by asking you the basic question of what is the nature and mission of Open Society Foundations, and I think in particular in your organizations it's really interesting to talk about the two perspectives that you, the two roles that you marry, if you will.
Yeah, Open Society Foundations, as you say, we marry two things together, which is that we are both grant-making but also operational. And the grant-making dimension is fairly straightforward. Obviously, we mobilize resources based on the input of our founder and benefactor, Mr. George Soros. And we support a variety of initiatives across the world in the areas of transparency, accountability, human rights, all manner of open society type issues. But the operationality is also that we actually have a number of programs that we run ourselves. And that's actually the side of the work that I'm located myself.
I see. That's quite interesting. I'm just going to probe a little bit on that. Would it be correct to say that there are not that many foundations who also have an operational role?
That's correct.
That is correct?
And it's a very unique sort of combination.
So my logical follow-up question then is, what are the opportunities in combining those two roles, and what are the internal tensions that OSF has to deal with as a result?
The opportunities are quite a few. For starters, I think when you have these two worlds coming together, you probably get the best by way of interventions and outcomes in the not-for-profit sector, but also even in terms of our relationships when we support governments and so on. So take, for instance, the area of transparency and accountability. Because we can support a number of organizations through our grant making, we are able to fund NGOs, civics, media organizations, individual journalists, all manner of actors that are engaged in transparency efforts, be it budget transparency, so the International Budget Partnership, for instance, or extractive industries, let's say Global Witness, for instance, or Publish What You Pay. Right. But at the same time, because we also have a level of operationality, we're able to deploy some of the intellectual capabilities that we have within the organization, the experience that our own staff bring to the table, the networks that we're able to command, and the knowledge that we have generated over time. We are able to bring all that to bear on the transparency and accountability question. So, for instance, in the traditional region where we operated in Central and Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, one of the things that we have been able to do was to support the development of freedom of information laws that have very much supported the arena of transparency and accountability. At the same time, we were able operationally to litigate, to do legal advocacy through, for instance, our Open Society Justice Initiative, again enlarging the transparency and accountability area. At the same time, we were able to support through scholarships the capabilities of people, but at the same time use those people as researchers, as input makers, as community leaders, as organizers in a more operational way. So I think the combinations themselves offer a very rich tapestry of engagement that strengthens our efforts. It's not without tensions, as you say. I mean, obviously, we need to consciously think of the balance between operationality and grant making. we need to ensure that our operational efforts do not take the space away from the partners that we support, because that's fundamental for us. One of the strengths, in my view, of our model of operation is precisely that we defer to local actors and to local organizations as those we have knowledge of their own domestic reality. And you want to support that and not to substitute it. And I think managing or calibrating that tension or that relationship is very critical for us.
It's critical, yes. How did you personally become first interested in transnational activism? You have quite a background in your home country, Zimbabwe, but also more broadly.
Yeah, I would say my life so far has been in the field generally of rights, the rule of law, transnational activism, and so on. And I started off in Zimbabwe with the opportunity to provide some leadership nationally on human rights and democracy building and rule of law issues, and progressively also worked within regional spaces within Southern Africa and Africa. And my own background is in law, and within that I've always had a commitment to the rule of law, but also the international mobilization, as it were, of actors to support the rule of law. And presently I sit at the Open Society Foundations within that trajectory. So I see myself as continuing to work in areas where I'm able to support the global rule of law and human rights and transparency.
Mm-hmm. So you've already kind of characterized Open Society Foundations a little bit for us. What are currently, let's say, up to 3 core challenges that OSF is facing, and how is your organization dealing with those? So I'm talking about challenges as a foundation as well as operational organization.
Yeah. One of the things that I would say perhaps we face as a challenge out there is that obviously the world is changing in many ways. From the time that we started, we were focused that time in our traditional region, again, as I said, with the opening up of the Soviet system, which is where institutionally we began. Although we had some interventions by our founder and benefactor, for instance, his support for black students to attend the University of Cape Town back in apartheid South Africa. But when you compare the institutional foundations, that time where really you could intervene on the basis of the opportunity, riding, as it were, the tide of opportunity of the revolutionary epoch-making changes in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, is a different time from where we are now, where we are really engaged more in a global struggle for open society on an ongoing basis. So there is no revolutionary moment as such. They may be in particular contexts and situations, but it is not the leitmotif of our engagement. It's a varied canvas of opportunities, of complexity, of pushback, of success in times and in places and so on. So it's a more complex arena, and if you also consider, of course, some of the diminishing capacities of civil society globally, partly through the struggle for resources, especially with the global financial crisis recently, but also partly through some of the restrictions in the space in which civil society operates in some of the countries that are important for the global struggle for open society. So all these, I think, are important changes. And obviously, geopolitically, I mean, they're important changes that one sees in the world as it then was, the role of the United States, questions of United Nations reform, issues of reform of multilateral institutions, the global trading system, and so on. All these are contested spaces in a manner that they obviously weren't a few years ago. So an Open Society Foundation that's engaging with that space is bound, obviously, to be in a position where you increasingly must be thoughtful about how you work best in that context. More institutionally, we continue, obviously, to try to strengthen our systems in terms of monitoring, evaluating our work, establishing impact, and confirming to ourselves or checking with ourselves and with others that we continue to be as responsive as we must be to the reality on the ground and to the needs of our partners.
Let me follow up on that. Can you very briefly describe what you mentioned before as the devolution of decision-making within OSF around grant-making? That was very interesting to me.
So I think the model that we use, which perhaps one could consider as fairly unique, but certainly as interesting in any event, is that Open Society Foundation's premise is whole operation on the basis that it is local people that know best their problems and potentially the solutions to those problems. So our president, Ari Naya, coming from the pedigree of the American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch and so on, is an accomplished international human rights advocate himself. Our founder and benefactor, George Soros, is obviously well known for his own public intellectual platforms and philosophies. But when it actually comes to daily decisions about what we must do in Pakistan, what we must do in Colombia, what we must do in Zambia, they defer to the locals that are there through boards of directors that have actually been established in those contexts. And it is those boards that determine where the grant resources must go, on the basis that they can adjudicate the needs in those contexts much more carefully and much more informedly, as it were, than anyone can sitting at the center. So it is that devolution that I was talking about, and I think it is a useful model in my estimation, precisely because it enables the sharpest, the quickest, and the most efficient response to the needs on the ground. But I think it also enables responsible resource deployment, because there are many matters, obviously, that one must put into the calculus of putting resources on the ground for any cause. And I think it is locals that are best placed to provide, if you will, the best solution.
I see. And would you say that OSF in that regard is also somewhat unique, or are there actually a number of major U.S. foundations who follow a same kind of devolved decision-making around both grant-making and any operational work that they do?
There are different models, and I wouldn't go into detail about how others operate, but I would say I think the uniqueness is in that in the Open Society Foundation's approach, it is actually an institutionalized arrangement.
I see.
So you find that when you go in to Azerbaijan, or you go into Tajikistan, or into West Africa, and you find the foundation there, it's not a field office of some sender, It is actually an entity that's legally, existentially an important actor within the context of that space or that country or that region, and it determines priorities on the ground, and there is a board that's respected, and of course there are institutional coordinations and internal support mechanisms, but the gravamen of decisions that are made really sits with those local actors.
Interesting. Now, you already mentioned briefly that institutionally, OSF needs to constantly ask itself how it's monitoring, how you're evaluating, how you assess effectiveness. How do you know when OSF is effective, at least for the portions that you're responsible for? How do you assess that as an organization?
It's a big question. I would not be glib about it at all. I mean, because it's big because you can monitor and evaluate from a bin counting sort of perspective. How much have we done? How many meetings have been held by the partner that we have given a grant? But that has limits in terms of its utility. Because obviously at one level it can be something that's unduly onerous on even partners to be asked maybe to be reporting on the minutiae of what they have done. There are others who even use a model where they want to ensure that for each meeting you're going to send the list of names and you can verify and so on. So monitoring and evaluation of that sense and magnitude can be problematic. But what we try to do is to ask the important questions of effectiveness and efficiency in the use of resources. So we say first to ourselves, but also to those that we support, what are we setting out to do? What's the issue? What are we trying to deal with? So if you take, for instance, a field such as human rights, we will look at it as a field and we will say, if you are to be effective in the field of human rights, what 5 or 6 things do you need? So we'll say you need an international human rights monitor in each country so that you can have reliable human rights monitoring reports where you can actually get a sense of what's happening on the ground. You need an international monitor, perhaps 1 or 2, that can help to support the national monitoring efforts, but also relate to international human rights monitoring issues and discourses. You need perhaps specialized monitors, let's say in areas like the rights of gay and lesbian and transsexual people. You need perhaps specialized monitoring in an area such as international justice, precisely because of the challenges that you will find within that area, and so on and so forth. And then you identify those issues, and then you say, how do we work towards these? And you can then have monitoring and evaluation conversations that are based on very clear targets that you set for yourselves internally, but also that you can negotiate with your partners. So that's the model we have tried to use. It's not perfect by any means, and we're actually continually trying to improve on it. But it is about sort of keeping one's eyes on the ball and trying to ensure indeed that we are clear about those big objectives, that we are attaining them, but also that, of course, we are attaining them on the minimum cost that's possible, and less about how many meetings and how many buses and so on and so forth.
The input or output level. Yes. My last question then is, in the case, you've been with OSF now since 2000, you told me, so 2000. Over 10 years. What leadership skills, both formal and informal, do you feel are crucial to be an effective leader in a foundation that also has an operational role such as OSF? What does it mean to be a good leader in OSF?
It's an interesting question. If I were looking at the OSF president, I think his leadership has been and is about subject matter leadership that you can respect him about, but also personal integrity and also a level of organizational acumen. If I was considering my level of leadership, sort of at that next level, I think it is also about an intellectual grasp that's needed to be able to deal with a range of issues simultaneously, because we are looking at a very complex organization, a whole canvas of interventions ranging from justice through health, through education, right through to women's rights and so on. And you want to be able to provide informed advice, feedback, and to have thoughtful engagement with those different areas. So it's necessary that you have a certain level of intellectual breadth to be able to provide any meaningful leadership. But organizational skills are also critical in terms of functionality. So important, for instance, to be able to manage staff and manage other resources. It's important to be able to have the usual strategic skills such as strategic planning, the reading of strategic questions in an environment, an appreciation of the critical questions for each discipline or each environment, and the problems that need to be resolved, planning capabilities. Then I think it also helps, in my experience, I think speaking for myself and my own trajectory, as you said, to have, I think, a commitment and a passion also to the issues, because I think we work in what can be a fairly exhausting arena in the sense that obviously you are not seeing 3,000 outputs on the conveyor belt in an assembly line.
Right.
Nor are you seeing outcomes tomorrow. Some of the things are long-term, some are medium-term. In some cases, we have grantees and partners that are at risk in closed societies. In some cases, you may be at risk yourself. In some cases, you may have many other frustrations and limitations that are placed in the work that you do. So I think as a leadership faculty and facility, just the ability to actually relate to what you are doing at a level of deep passion and commitment, I think is also almost as critical as perhaps the substantive and organizational skills.
Interesting. This has been a very interesting interview. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.